Okay, let's dive in. You sent over some pretty dense but fascinating material from Jürgen Habermas.
Yeah, his book Knowledge and Human Interests, specifically that idea about the prehistory of positivism.
Right. And look, this might sound like, really abstract philosophy, but bear with us. It's actually crucial for understanding why we value certain kinds of knowledge today.
Where does that emphasis on, say, scientific proof come from? What's the backstory?
Exactly. It's like the intellectual DNA of how we handle information now.
Yeah.
So our mission here is basically to cut through the jargon.
Yeah, pull out the key stuff. For people who want to get informed, get those aha moments without getting bogged down.
So Habermas kicks things off by arguing that seeking knowledge isn't just passive. It's not neutral.
No, definitely not. He says it's driven by these fundamental human interests. We're actively looking for knowledge for particular reasons.
And he names three, right? There's the technical interest.
Controlling our world. Think science, technology.
Then the practical interest that's about understanding each other, how society works.
Communication, social norms, that kind of thing.
And finally, the emancipatory interest. The drive to be free from constraints, from domination.
Right. But for this deep dive, we're really zoning in on how those first two, the technical and the practical,
and the philosophical debates swirling around them,
sort of set the stage for what we now call positivism.
That whole approach emphasizing empirical facts, observable evidence, and this idea of one unified scientific method for everything.
But Habermas sees this interesting period before positivism really cements itself. He talks about a breakdown.
Yeah, a breakdown in the traditional theory of knowledge, or epistemology, how philosophers even defined what knowledge is.
He points to Hegel kind of taking a shot at Kant.
Right. So epistemology tries to set the rules for knowledge, yeah. And Hegel basically asks, hang on, how can you possibly define the rules for knowing before you actually go out and experience anything?
It's a bit circular, yeah. Like writing the rule book for a game you've never played.
Exactly. Then Marx comes along and shifts the focus dramatically.
From individual consciousness, from pure thought.
To the material world.
Yeah.
To labor, production, social structures.
Habermas sees that as absolutely crucial, recognizing the social roots of knowledge. But maybe
a bit too focused just on the material? Is that the idea?
Kind of. He sees it as a vital step, but perhaps not the full story of human interests driving knowledge.
So all this philosophical turmoil, Habermas argues it created a sort of space, a vacuum.
Yeah, a vacuum. The old ways of grounding knowledge felt shaky, and positivism, with its focus on clear scientific methods and observable data,
it just seemed to fit right in, offered some certainty.
It stepped in powerfully, but Habermas suggests maybe it did so without enough self-reflection about its own basis.
Okay, so who are the key players Habermas flags in this prehistory?
Well, he points to early positivists like Comte.
I guess Comte, yeah. Big promoter of science as the ultimate stage of human understanding, his law of three stages.
Right, science is the peak. Then there's Ernst Mach.
Mach really hammered home the idea that science must be based purely on sensory experience, didn't he?
Absolutely. If you can't see it, touch it, measure it somehow through your senses, it's suspect.
But it wasn't just the hardcore positivists, was it? Habermas brings in others.
No, that's what's interesting. He looks at pragmatism, like Charles Sanders Peirce.
Peirce emphasized practical consequences and, crucially, agreement within the scientific community.
Yeah, that consensus among researchers becomes a key part of validating knowledge. That sounds pretty familiar today.
And even just the way the natural sciences themselves were evolving.
Getting more formalized, developing specific languages, experimental protocols.
All reinforcing that focus on objective, repeatable methods.
And then there's the other side, the human sciences, or Geisteswissenschaften. He looks at Dilthey.
Wilhelm Dilthey, who argued that you can't just explain human actions like physical events, you have to understand them. Verstehen.
Right, understanding meaning, context, history. It seems like the opposite of positivism.
But Habermas finds a twist, right?
He does. Paradoxically, he suggests that even this push for rigorous understanding and interpretation in the human sciences kind of contributed to its own form of positivism.
Also,
by seeking objective methods for interpretation, trying to make the study of meaning itself more scientific in a way, it still often adopted that positivist impulse for methodological rigor, even with subjective material.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway for us now? Why does this history lesson matter?
Well, Habermas isn't just giving us a historical tour. His point is that positivism, for all its power and usefulness,
And it is incredibly powerful.
might have inadvertently led us to forget those underlying human interests, the technical, practical, and especially the emancipatory, that are always shaping our quest for knowledge.
He contrasts it with something like Freudian psychoanalysis.
Yeah, which he sees, maybe controversially, as a type of science that inherently includes self-reflection, aimed at liberation or emancipation from internal constraints.
He even mentions Nietzsche's will to power as another attempt to grasp a fundamental driving force, though he finds it a bit too reductive.
Ultimately, Habermas is calling for us to recover what he calls the forgotten experience of reflection.
Meaning, we need to think about why we pursue knowledge and the assumptions built into our methods.
Exactly. By understanding this prehistory, by seeing how positivism arose partly from unresolved philosophical questions and specific interests, we can become more aware.
More critical of its claims to be the only way to valid knowledge.
Precisely. Aware of its assumptions, its limitations, and that awareness, he thinks, opens the door to potentially more critical, more freeing ways of thinking about knowledge, about society.
So the final thought for our listeners to maybe chew on: how does knowing this backstory potentially change how you evaluate information day to day?
Yeah. Are there hidden interests, technical needs for control, practical needs for social order, shaping the kinds of data or experts you trust? Things you weren't maybe consciously aware of.
It's definitely something worth reflecting on, how these philosophical currents from way back still ripple through our modern world.